Hello, and welcome to the very last LEAP review video for your biology course. This is the end of Unit 4, and so far for Unit 4, we have talked about photosynthesis, and which is the process where plants, with the help of the energy from the sun, use carbon dioxide and water to make glucose and to release oxygen. And so then we learned about the process that is the opposite of photosynthesis, and that's called cellular respiration. And that is where plants and animals take the glucose and the oxygen that is produced during photosynthesis and break down that glucose to create the energy in the form of ATP that they need to survive. And during that process, they release carbon dioxide and water, which is thereby used by photosynthesis again. And we talked about how those two processes they go together, they feed each other to make a continuous cycle. And then after that, we talked about the carbon cycle, and we talked about how carbon is continuously being recycled in our biosphere. And we talked about some of the problems that we're having with carbon dioxide buildup in our atmosphere from cutting down too many trees and from burning too many fossil fuels. And so now our last video review, we're gonna just gloss over a lot of just the key points in ecology. Most of these things you will have heard before in middle school, but you need a little review before you take your LEAP test. So let's start off with talking about some key terms. One of those is called a limiting factor. And so when you have a population of organisms, whether they are plants or animals, you are going to have certain factors that limit the growth of that population. So in other words, one particular type of animal or plant cannot grow indefinitely into a larger and larger population. Eventually, there are going to be some factors that limit their growth. So there's two types of limiting factors. One is density-dependent limiting factors, and the density-dependent factors depend on the number of organisms living in an area. So these factors will limit the growth of a population more so if there are a lot of living organisms in that particular ecosystem. So things like disease, competition, and predation. The more organisms there are, the more these factors come into play. Now, density independent limiting factors affect an ecosystem equally, no matter if there's just a few living organisms or if there's many. So natural disasters like wildfires or hurricanes or tornadoes, drought, and the amount of sunlight are all, they don't depend on, they're not worse if there's more organisms, or if they're not less of a factor just because there's not very many organisms. So they don't depend on the density. So drought is a density independent factor. If there's a drought, it's bad, even if there's only a few organisms. Predation is a density dependent factor. So if there are more leopards in a particular area, predation is going to be a big factor in reducing or limiting the growth of the prey population. Okay, so limiting factors. Hold on. Okay. Limiting factors go hand in hand with a term called carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals in a particular species that an environment can support for long term. Okay, so remember, limiting factors come into play, and they limit the number of individuals of a particular species that can live in a particular environment. And those limiting factors impact the carrying capacity of the environment. So the carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals that can live in a particular ecosystem. Okay, there's two types of growth that we see in populations. There can be exponential growth, which creates a J-shaped curve on the graph. So let's look at this graph of exponential growth. So you've got population size on your y-axis and time on your x-axis. And you see with, You see with your exponential growth that growth starts out slow, but then increases over time. And then it just continues to increase very, very rapidly in a rather short period of time. And we saw exponential growth when we talked about bacteria, and we learned how fast bacteria can grow and how you can start with just one or two little bacteria, and then within a matter of 24 hours, you can have 1 million bacteria. That's exponential growth. That is not feasible because of limiting factors. There are going to be limiting factors on the growth of a population. So this cannot be sustained in any particular ecosystem over a long period of time. Eventually, we learned that bacteria run out of space, or they run out of food, or different factors which limit the growth of the bacteria population eventually. And so when those limiting factors kick in, you get what's called a logistic growth pattern. And this is more of a sustainable growth pattern. And instead of having a J-shaped curve, you get an S-shaped curve on a graph. So what you see is the population grows exponentially for a certain period of time, but then those limiting factors kick in, and the population cannot continue to grow at that exponential rate, and it begins to slow down and level off. This is called logistic growth, and it looks like an S. Okay. And the carrying capacity is the point at which that population growth levels off, because it's reached its maximum. That ecosystem has reached its maximum capacity to sustain growth for that particular species. Okay. So now energy is another factor involved in ecosystems, and energy flows through all the different organisms in an ecosystem, and energy always comes from the sun. So let's look at this food chain, which shows how energy flows in an ecosystem. And you see that it starts right here with the producers. All energy for an ecosystem ultimately comes from the sun, but animals cannot get energy directly from the sun. Only plants can, because plants are the only living things that can do photosynthesis. And we learned that photosynthesis is the process of capturing that energy from the sun and storing it in glucose. So this is where all food chains begin. So the energy flows from the producers, or initially from the sun to the producers, and then through various levels of consumers. So you have your primary consumers, which eat only plants. They're called herbivores. And then you got your secondary consumers, which eat the herbivores. They're carnivores. And then in some food chains, you have tertiary and quaternary consumers as well. So the tertiary consumers eat the secondary consumers, and the quaternary or the final consumers eat the tertiary consumers. So we see here that hawks consume the snakes, and so the energy is transferred from the snake to the hawk. And snakes consume frogs, so the energy is transferred from the frog to the snake. Frogs eat grasshoppers, so the energy from the grasshopper is transferred to the frog. Grasshoppers eat plants, so the energy from the plants is transferred to the grasshopper. So you see how the arrows follow the path of the energy flow, okay? And then eventually the hawk is going to die, and its body will be decomposed, and all the nutrients and things that were stored in the hawk will be returned to the soil by these decomposers, bacteria and fungi, and then eventually used again by the producers. Okay. But a single food chain does not give you an accurate depiction of what happens in most ecosystems. In most ecosystems, you have various primary consumers that eat the grasses or the plants, and then each of those primary consumers are eaten usually by more than one secondary consumer, and that energy continues to flow. So you see here that you've got rabbits, mice, and grasshoppers that are all primary consumers. They eat the plants, okay? But then you see that grasshoppers are eaten by frogs and birds. And then you see that snakes eat both the frogs and the birds. Okay. And then over here on the mice are eaten by the owls and the hawks and the foxes. And the rabbits are also eaten by the foxes and the hawks. And you'll see that hawks also eat the snakes. Okay, so the reason why this is important is because if something happened to the grasshoppers, let's say, okay, if the grasshoppers were, maybe somebody sprayed insecticide and killed all the grasshoppers, well, we're going to have a problem for the frogs and the birds because that's their main food source, okay? And if the frogs and the birds don't have enough food and their population size begins to go down, that's going to affect the snakes and eventually the hawks, okay? But the snakes more so than the hawks, because look what happens. The snakes eat the frogs and the birds. So if they don't have enough frogs and birds, then there's not going to be as much food for the snakes. So the snake population will go down. But the hawks will probably be okay because the hawks don't eat just snakes. The hawks also eat rabbits and mice. So the hawks will probably not be affected. Okay, the owls will be partially affected because they eat the frogs, but they also eat mice. So there will be okay. But if the grasshoppers go away, that's going to hurt the frogs, the birds, and eventually the snakes. Okay, so by having multiple food sources, that creates balance in this ecosystem. Okay. Now let's talk about the energy flow. Remember that in the food web and the food chain, the arrows are pointing in the direction of the energy flow. Okay, so energy flows from the grass into the mouse, into the grasshopper, into the rabbit. And then energy from the rabbit flows into the fox and into the hawk. Okay, that's how it goes. So let's look at an energy pyramid. This shows you how energy is lost as it moves up the food chain or up through the food web. So we have 100% of the energy from the sun is taken in by the plants and stored. So the primary producers have 100% of the energy. But when the primary consumers, like grasshoppers, eat the plants, only 10% of that energy is passed on. The other 90% is either used by the plants or lost as heat into the atmosphere. So then the same thing happens when the secondary consumers, like frogs, eat the primary consumers, like grasshoppers. Only 10% of this 10% moves up. So that means that only 1% of the original energy stored down here in the primary producers is passed on to the secondary consumers. And then the energy continues to diminish as you go on up to the tertiary consumers. If we went on up to the hawk, it would be 0.01 energy. And so what happens at each level of the food chain, the organism itself uses a good bit of that energy and loses a good bit of that energy as heat. So only 10% of the energy is passed on as it moves up. So that's why when you look at an ecosystem, you should see that the most abundant organism in the ecosystem is plants. And you've got to have plenty of plants to support all these other consumers. The next highest number in an ecosystem would be the number of primary consumers. So you're going to have a lot of grasshoppers, you're going to have a lot of mice. Let's see what else. You're going to have a lot of little rabbits, okay? Those are all your primary consumers. You're not going to have as many of those as you do plants, but you're going to have more of those than you do your secondary consumers. And remember, your secondary consumers are things like the fox, the owl, the frog, the bird, okay? And then you're going to have even less of these tertiary consumers, like your snakes and your fox is a tertiary. No, your fox is a secondary, but sometimes your fox is a tertiary. So it just depends. No, the fox is always a secondary, but your hawk, your owl can be a tertiary or a secondary, because your owl eats mice and frogs. And your hawk can be a tertiary or a secondary or even a quaternary consumer. So you're not going to see very many hawks in one particular area or one particular ecosystem. So these consumers that are higher than that tertiary are going to be few because there is less energy available to them in an ecosystem. Remember the 10% rule. So starts with 100% down at the bottom of the pyramid with your producers, and then only 10% moves up. And so it decreases by 90% every time. So primary consumers get 10%, secondary consumers get 1%, tertiary consumers get 0.1, and then if it goes above that, it's 0.01. But very few ecosystems will go above the tertiary because there's just not enough energy to support consumers at higher levels. And then remember that when all of these organisms die, the decomposers will break down that organic matter and recycle those nutrients back into the soil. Okay, a few more key terms in ecology. One is habitat, and habitat is the natural home or an environment of an animal, plant, or any living organism. A species is a group of living organisms that are similar and they're capable of breeding and producing fertile offspring. An example of a species would be the human species, or the canine species, or the feline species. And so they have to be able to breed and produce fertile offspring. So an example of non-species that can breed is like a horse. A horse and a donkey can breed successfully to produce a mule, but a mule cannot produce offspring. So therefore, a horse and a donkey are not the same species because they cannot produce fertile offspring. Okay, biodiversity is the variety of life in our world or in a particular habitat or ecosystem. Genetic diversity is the range of different inherited traits within a species. And then habitat fragmentation is the process where a large expanse of a habitat is transformed into smaller territories that are isolated from each other. And this can be a problem, and it's often caused by human interactions. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is biodiversity. And so remember, biodiversity is the variety of life in the world or in a particular habitat or ecosystem. And biodiversity is very important because remember when we talked about the food web, we saw that as long as organisms have various food sources, they can survive better when something happens to one particular food source. So if you'll recall, when we talked about this food web, we talked about if something happened to the grasshoppers, okay, so like maybe insecticide was sprayed in an area that killed off the grasshoppers, we saw how badly that would affect the frogs and the birds, but not so much the owls, because the owls have other food sources like the mice, okay? And so that means that this ecosystem has some biodiversity. So when one thing happens to one particular organism, it doesn't kill off all the other organisms if they have other sources of food. That is what biodiversity does. So there are some natural threats to biodiversity, things such as wildfire, floods, drought, volcanic eruptions, asteroid strikes, disease, competition, reduced food supply, and climate change. Those things can cause extinction or can greatly reduce a population. And when one species is taken out of an ecosystem or is reduced, that can affect other species, especially if that is their sole food source. And so all of these things can cause a decrease in biodiversity, but these are natural things that we really can't do anything about. However, there are some threats to biodiversity that we can do something about, and because we cause them. And so things like overhunting or overfishing, overharvesting of plants, pollution, deforestation, habitat fragmentation, invasive species, and global climate change are all things that humans have caused that are threatening biodiversity. Habitat loss comes from habitat fragmentation and humans building highways and roads for our convenience, cuts the habitats into fragments, and it prevents animals from being able to go to different places where they used to go, which means that species end up breeding with only those that are left in their habitat. And so that can decrease genetic diversity and can lead to problems in the population. We've talked about global climate change and how that can impact different environments. There are places in the world where global warming is actually reducing the frog population, and some frog species are actually becoming extinct because frogs cannot maintain their internal body temperature. So if it gets too warm for them in their particular area where they live, they can't survive. And we saw that frogs are a food source for a lot of different species, and frogs also eat a lot of insects. And so when you take out the frog population, you have an overpopulation of some insects, and you don't have as much food for other animals. So it's a domino effect whenever one species is taken out, and climate change is causing that to happen. And then we've talked about these other things, deforestation. If we cut down too many of the trees, that is leading to excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Pollution is putting excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that is causing that greenhouse effect, which is causing global climate change. So all of these things, overhunting and fishing, overharvesting, that is depleting the fish population and other populations of animals. And we need that biodiversity in order to have healthy ecosystems. Okay, and so that's it. Thank you for your attention. And we have completed our biology leap review. Thank you for your attention, and goodbye.